this. So I want to welcome you. My name is Cynthia Brame. I'm at the Center for Teaching, and I'm so glad to see all of you for this conversation on teaching that is focusing on online courses and specifically on engaging our students in synchronous sessions and online courses. So we have 4 panelists, and I'm going to introduce them to you in a different order than in the information that I sent you, but in the order that they're going to speak. So we have Jessica Watkins, who is in the Department of Teaching and Learning in Science Education. She's going to describe approaches that she found helpful for promoting small group work and effective preparation in an online course that had both graduate students and upper level undergraduates. Okay. We have Diana Heney from the Philosophy Department. She's going to discuss lessons that she distilled from both introductory and upper level philosophy courses, one that she taught with a TA and one that she taught without. Okay. And then Thomas Clements and Kathy Friedman, can y'all wave? Thank you. They're both from the Department of Biological Sciences. They co-taught this fall, and they're going to talk about their use of undergraduate learning assistants who they use to facilitate interaction in a high enrollment introductory course. Okay, so that's the plan. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to start with the panelists telling us about their experiences. So first Jessica and then Diana will each spend about 7 to 8 minutes explaining their approaches. And then Kathy and Thomas will together spend 10 to 12 minutes sharing their experiences. During that time, I'm going to ask that you and I turn off our videos and hide non-video participants, which will let us really focus in on what the panelists are saying. And if you don't remember how to do that, or maybe never knew, I'll show you in just a second, okay? After the panelists have spoken, I'll invite you all to turn your videos back on, and so we can see what questions and observations came up for you that you'd like to share. All right, does that sound okay with everybody? All right, so I'm gonna share my screen in case. See anybody's so if you're not a panelist, here's what I'd like for you to do now. I'd like for you to turn off your video and then go to your video settings. So I get to it by clicking on this little upward right arrow to the upward right of my little video icon. I go to video settings and then I choose this hide non-video participants. So that's what I'd like for you to do now if you're not a panelist. All right, Jess, you want to take it away? Oh, and Diana and Jess and Kathy and Thomas, like you can share your screen, so you can share whatever you'd like. Right?
Awesome. Hi, well, thank you so much for having me. So I am an assistant professor of science education at Peabody. And this fall, I taught a small course. So I'm going to say that this is there's only about 6 students. So but I do have taught larger courses in online. So I'll kind of talk about how I made modifications from small to maybe a larger course and how that might work. And I'll probably show some of my students' work, but I took off all their names so I can share a little bit of what I did to help prepare for this. I will say, one thing that I found particularly challenging, even with 6 students, is that whole class discussion can be really challenging to get going. There's something about having to unmute and the awkwardness of knowing when to do that. So it took a lot of preparation and forethought into thinking about how can I make sure that these conversations can get flowing, because that's where we do a lot of our deep learning in my course. The course is actually it's about developing or understanding how students develop science literacy. So it's for pre-service teachers. So we're actually doing a lot of meta talk about how to do teaching in there too. So that's actually kind of helpful in reflecting on your practice with them. So a couple of the strategies, just to get concrete. I had a reading every week, and I used Perusall. I'm not going to talk about that because there's plenty of resources around that to help get the conversation started. But I found that to be really helpful in thinking for me and planning the kinds of questions that I want to ask by seeing what are the things that they're noticing and where do I want to help deepen their thinking. But in addition to that, a lot of the questions that I would prepare for, say, in an in-person class, the kind of conversation pieces, I would actually have them do some of that thinking either through, I use Google Drive a ton, through Jamboards or slides, or sometimes I would even pair them up to work together on these things after the readings ahead of time. So I'm going to share a couple of those just to get a chance to see. I feel like listening to me talk is one thing, but getting to see what the students did can be really fun too. So let me actually make sure I'm going to share the right thing. Cancel this. So for the early on, this was an early assignment that I had them do, is they read about cognitive science and science education. And it's a really dense article that talks about different theories of learning. So I asked them before class to come up with a model somehow for what they thought the author meant by strong restructuring or weak restructuring. And I gave them an example. And I asked them to include their name and then have that be a way to structure the small group conversations later. So they each came up with their own example, and you can see they're pretty different, but this gave them something concrete so that when they were in small groups, that they could be able to compare and contrast, like, why did you draw this? Or why did you make this? And how does this connect to my understanding of what I did? So it was a nice tool to structure that small group that in terms of like getting in, sometimes they're like, what do I do? This gave them like an artifact, something they can look at together and kind of explain to one another as a way to ease into. So this was early in the semester before they really knew each other, that they can be able to talk and think about that. So that was one activity that I thought was helpful for small group. I also used a lot of Jamboards. Can you all see the Jamboard now? Okay, I wasn't sure if it switched quickly. To get conversations going. I think that there was a lot of Post-it notes and for some of them, this one was a long one where they had a lot to say. But it was another way to start thinking about like, what are the benefits of translanguaging in this paper, or what questions are still lingering that didn't necessarily come up in Perusall, but gave them a chance to be able to read and think about that. So I found those Jamboards as a nice way to be able to get them thinking, get those ideas out ahead of time. And in a more synthesis-y way than you would get into through Perusall comments. And then lastly, some of the articles were more challenging. So we did talk about race and racism in the class, especially related to science. And I found that doing that over Zoom, it's really hard. You have to have a lot of political trust to be able to have those conversations. So one thing that I did for the students is, instead of asking them to do a Jamboard where everything's out in the open ahead of time, is I gave them a tool that they could use individually, and that would help them. So I did a lot of the summary instead of asking them to do the summary, and then ask them to sort of jot down their examples and share them with me privately ahead of time. And this was a way that I can help scope, like, where are there potential areas that I want to push? Where are some tensions that might emerge, and helping me prepare for this question, these kind of conversations on Zoom. And so I learned a lot of that from going through a lot of different trainings from the CFT, but also from my department, around thinking about how do we start surfacing some of these conversations and digging in ways. And doing that over Zoom seemed like a particularly big challenge. And so I wanted to make sure that I was aware of what students are going to be saying and what the kind of ideas that they might be bringing up, so I can make sure that that conversation was going smoothly, while also supporting students' learning and trying to create a productive and brave space for them. So that's kind of my first beginning part of thinking about, like, what are some of the structures that I put in place to help facilitate some of that, like, what did I need to have in place to get things going in the classroom? But then the question is, what do you do in the classroom when it's actually ongoing? So there's the whole class conversation where I can get to listen and I get to hear. One thing I did was chat blasts, which you may have heard of. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second. So not that I can see, that way I can see at least names. I did chat blast, which is basically you ask students to write some idea. Like, if I had this moment, I'm like, I really want to hear what everybody's thinking right about this idea right now. And I give them a few minutes and they can write it in the chat. And about a question, they write it in the chat, and then everybody presses enter at once. And I always found that to be really fun to be able to see all the different ideas. One thing they told me though that was really important for them is that if the professor didn't go through those ideas, that it kind of felt they didn't really see the point. So it was really important to not just have them do that and then not go through and kind of make connections between how people are thinking. So what I do when I have a larger group, so with 6 students, it's really easy to go through. But if you have a larger group to do that, that can be really challenging to be able to see. So I'm thinking medium size now. I'm not Kathy and Thomas. I'll let them think about big sizes. But for a group of like say 15 or 20, I don't think I would do chat blasts. I'm going to use Jamboards in that way. And it has the same idea, but then you can move ideas around. Like where do you see, it's a nice way to kind of visually group different ideas and how different people are thinking about things and be able to draw connections across that you can't do through the chat. So that's my big suggestion for thinking about how to engage the whole class in a way. I can do that. My last thing is then in small groups. One of the big challenges in small groups, like when you're in person and you go in small groups, you can kind of like, what are they doing over there? What are their ideas? You can kind of listen without interfering. The big challenge in small groups or breakout groups is as soon as you show up, they're like, uh-oh, she's here. And you can kind of stop the conversation, or you have to you interrupt it in some ways. And you can't do this kind of, I kind of want to know where you are in this moment. So one thing I found really useful is to have them do a task that I can monitor, like, and I'll show you an example in a second, that I can monitor without having to enter the breakout rooms. And so now I'll share my screen again. So share, and this one, I'll do this one, because this one was actually really fun to watch as they were drawing arrows. So this prompt that I had given them was to start to make connections between ideas. So I can imagine this for different concept maps, like asking them, how do they see, this was like the different articles we'd read. These were the kinds of big ideas that they had discussed learning. And these were the different other activities we had done. And I'd ask them to see, like, where do you see connections across these? Like, how are you seeing these things as connecting? And what was really cool was that I got to monitor, like as they were doing it, it shows up. And so I got to see, when are students working? What are the kinds of connections? Do I see similar connections that people are making? Or there's similar kinds of maps? And right now it looks like a mess, but at the time I could kind of see what were the things that they were prioritizing. And it was a way for me to be able to see the different kinds of activity that was taking place as they were doing their small groups without like jumping in and interfering. Lastly, I recommend also, I did this at times, was having different group roles can be useful. Having somebody monitor the chat, having somebody check for equitable participation, having somebody do the Jamboard or the whiteboard as something that we can share afterwards has been really a nice, useful way to make sure everybody is involved. And then my last point is I also didn't care if they went off topic, and told them that sometimes, because it's been a really isolating time for the pandemic. So I don't want them to spend, 20 minutes off topic, but if there's times when they're doing some community building, I felt that was really important for the class, and for them to start to build some relationships that they would get during breaks, or that they would get before and after class, or even during the small groups in class, they would get to know one another. And so I made it clear, like if they were off topic and I came in the breakout room, I told them that it was okay, and I'm glad. And what did you talk about? Like it wasn't something that they had to feel like wrong for doing. So I think that's my time, but I just those were some of the big ideas that I feel like I learned with my students this semester.
Yeah. Thank you. And so Jessica, just so those first 3 that you showed, where you gave sort of a concrete prompt, where they would sort of have multiple possible ways of showing restructuring, and then the Jamboard, and then the private Google sheet that they would fill out. Those were things that you did to help them prepare for class.
And that would end up structuring what we did in class, right? Like it was a little bit of both. Like they would do that as a structure. So then there was something really tangible that they were talking about in class.
Right.
Because I felt like if I just went in there, like, what'd you think about the article? It was going to be harder to be able to ease them into that. There's not going to be those side conversations that you might be able to pick up and say, oh, I heard you say X, Y, and Z.
Right.
that you would have, that I would typically have like ahead of time. Like you couldn't ease into things in the same way because it doesn't have that free form. Everybody's muted. I would make them unmute a lot of times too, so I wasn't just talking to a screen all the time.
Thank you. Diana, will you share your approach?
Yes, please. I'm going to share some slides. I found with teaching online that using slides and sharing them at the beginning of a session really helped me to stay on task and be responsible for the things I said I would do. So I thought I should do that for this as well, just to keep myself on track. So give me a moment. I'll just pull this up. Okay, so we should have a bright purple slide in front of you. That's what we're seeing. Excellent. Okay, so I'm just going to walk through some of what, I don't want to say what worked for me, but some of what I did. And you all can say what you think about that afterwards, or ask me any questions that come to mind for you in balancing synchronous and asynchronous elements in my online courses. So by way of background, this was my 7th year of full-time teaching. I had done a teaching certificate when I was a graduate student, and I loved it and I found it so helpful. And last spring, when we were all kind of moved online, I felt like I had no idea what I was doing for the first time in a while. And that was good in a way. It was like a humbling experience. And then over the summer, I did the Center for Teaching's Online Course Design Institute, and I found it just enormously helpful. So anything that sounds sensible that you're about to hear was because of the Institute, not because of any innate abilities of mine. So I had 2 really different courses, is maybe the first thing to notice. One of them was a 40-person intro class, Introduction to Medical Ethics. I had 40 students and a teaching assistant. You'll also see there's a W next to that. That was a 40-person writing intensive course. That was a mistake, but I don't regret it. It worked out okay in the end. And then the other class was a 30-person elective, this 3,000 level philosophy course called Ethics and Mental Health. So they were pretty different in a lot of ways. But one thing that I held in common between the 2 classes was that on a Tuesday, Thursday schedule, they had one day asynchronous and one day synchronous every week. And so that gave me time for them to do kind of content learning with videos and things like that on their own, and activities with me or with my teaching assistant in the classroom. And so having them with me one day a week, I felt allowed me to really set the expectation of, you're here, I need you as much all the way here as it's possible for you to be, understanding that sometimes that's not all the way here, but as much as possible all the way here. One of the things that putting the class online forced me to do was like really go back to bare bones, like what am I doing here? Like what are the goals? So these were the goals of the Introduction to Medical Ethics class. And this is a piece of art we used to frame the discourse for the semester. It's a stone sculpture from the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. And the image is the god of death who guards the gate to the underworld inside the circle of life. And so we're talking about medicine and medical ethics, life and death stuff. During a pandemic, you know, we needed things to focus on, and understanding that we're part of a history and a tradition and ways of thinking about this that philosophers have said things about was our starting place. With the mental health class, the goals were somewhat different. It's more advanced, more expectation that they had some proficiency already that they were building on. And there's also a sense of being in like really uncharted territory, because a lot of our understanding of mental health and mental illness is still developing, so much still to learn, so many conversations still to have. And so this is a picture by the surrealist Remedios Varo called Embroidering the Earth's Mantle. And the people in the center here are actually building the earth, right? They're weaving the earth from their own materials. And I try to bring the students back to this throughout the term, like we're building our own understanding here. We don't just have a knowledge download model here where we can easily learn what there is to know. So I tried to start with this frame. With a teaching assistant, I'm going to say, of course, that's a gift to have a teaching assistant. Mine was fabulous. I tried really hard to protect her as much as possible, while also using her to the fullest extent of her abilities, which were considerable. So I was very fortunate. But I did tried to do small things, like I didn't put her email address on the syllabus. If you want to complain about your grades or whatever, you email your professor, not your teaching assistant, leave her be. We divided our active time together into discussion groups, writerly tasks, and writing workshops. So in terms of delegating, my teaching assistant led the discussion groups. She would do guided group discussion. So as Jessica was saying, not just turning them loose in small groups, but like setting a frame, setting a time frame, bringing them back together. Guided writing exercises, which can sound a little excruciating, like sitting all together and writing on Zoom, but actually turned out to be very effective. You know, like, we're going to do this, we're all going to do it, and then we're going to talk. And then at times, instead of having small groups of 4 or 5 students, going with like a pair, I think pair share, where someone, you could talk just to one other person and sometimes have a bit of a deeper conversation. So when she led the online synchronous sessions, she did the discussion groups. I led the writing workshops. It was really important to me in teaching a W class online that we try to mimic as much of what we would do if we were together. Lots of types of writing exercises, lots of low stakes writing exercises, and just give people that experience of like, you're taking a class with a W on it, not just to tick a box, although we will do that, but also to talk about writing and think about practicing it together. In the other class, my big challenge was framing things and keeping us in a productive conversation with 30 folks, mostly seniors, with lots of education, knowledge, and opinions, keeping that sort of moving productively. I would begin my synchronous classes with a nod to what I had been doing asynchronously. And I also asked my students very early in the class to weigh in on how they wanted to do breakout rooms. This was really interesting to me because I gave them a set of options. It's like, okay, here's things we could do. We could have a free-for-all 30-person philosophical melee, just like just wildness. We could start together, have a target question, small groups, big group. We could do student-led, large group with target questions, micro lecture, target questions, small groups, big groups, think, pair, share, insert your own suggestions. Only philosophy majors who I had taught before said they wanted the philosophical melee style. So I ruled that out right away. It's like, this is not something we should be doing if only people who feel really confident in this space want it. So let's not do that. Nobody wanted a student-led discussion. It's like, okay, interesting. Nobody's up for that responsibility right now. Fair. That's totally fine. We're all in our jammies by, October. So whatever works for you. So we wound up doing mostly either the micro lecture target question option, the 4th option, or the 2nd option, starting together, targeting a question, smaller groups, bigger groups. And we just varied based on what we were doing. So I want to be mindful of time, but I also thought it would just be helpful to walk through an example. I really appreciated Jessica doing that as well, just like seeing what you actually did. So this is an example of the frame I set at the beginning of one of the sessions of the seminar class. So we started off by just kind of collecting what they had said, going back to discussing something that was in the text and then projecting this towards where we'd be going next. With a class where they're only with me once a week, I spent a lot of time looking at their perusal responses, reading their discussion boards, looking at their short writing exercises, and trying to show them that I was doing that so that they could see that their effort in these writerly tasks was meaningful and important and was advancing the conversation. So every couple of weeks, I would try to generate something from their writing for them to look at as a conversation piece. So that's what I'm about to show you here. So we had been reading this book called The Disordered Mind by George Brame. It's an attempt to give a philosophical analysis of mental health and mental illness that is a kind of a conceptual competitor to the account that's in the DSM, which is the standard clinical tool. So we had read 4 chapters of this book, and this is a book that often students experience of. It seems to be, at first, they don't think they agree with it, and then they realize that they basically do agree with it and they can't figure out where to go next. So what I had them do, the author's name was Graham, I had them do this Grahamometer, like, how much do you actually agree with what this guy's saying? Like, here's 4 claims he makes. What do you say about each of those 4 claims? And so what I did then is I graphed their responses. But before I showed them the graphs, I asked for volunteers to interpret the graphs. So I got, I've got a class of 30. I just need 4 volunteers. I was always able to get at least that much uptake. And so the people in the class read out what was on the slides and then tried to say what they thought it meant. So here's an example. If you were in this tiny slice of pie here, that would be like a revelation for you, right? Wow, like I think differently about this than everyone else in the room with me. Lots of agreement here, but still some disagreement. This one's fun because some people just refuse to answer the question, which is a properly philosophical approach, of course. So we have question, possibilities, answers. And so seeing themselves in, like, represented, even though it's of course all anonymous, I'm not saying, and so said this thing in this slice of pie, allowed them to see that their work they were doing asynchronously was meaningful and was being added back into the course. So I think those were kind of the main things that I wanted to share just by way of some examples. I resonate with a lot of what Jessica had to say as well, but I should stop there so that there's lots of time for questions afterwards.
And Julaine had a question in the chat, but let's hold it. No, let's not. Let's just do this one question. So Julaine asked how students responded to interpreting those graphs as a discussion prompt.
I meant what did you use a Google form? Like how did they input their response so for you to graph it?
Oh, so that's a great question. I had a bucket in my evaluation called writerly tasks, which was code for all the stuff I will make you do on Brightspace. So that particular thing was an assignment. And so as I was going through their assignments and commenting on them, I was just pulling the numbers, right? Like ticking boxes. This is what this person said about 1, 2, 3, and 4 as I was commenting on their draft. So since I had to comment on what they said anyway, it wasn't any work really for me to keep track of the numbers at the same time.
Thank you so much. Kathy and Thomas, you want to take it away?
Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the LA program in general and how we adapted it for use in the fall for a completely online environment. So LAs are undergraduate students who have previously successfully taken a course. Then they are then interviewed and selected by instructors to work with them to help facilitate discussion and facilitate active learning in the classroom. They play no role in grading, no role in assessment design. They're purely there to help the instructors facilitate and like kind of bring in a more small group environment as opposed to just this one person. I always like to use the phrase, the sage on a stage. It's kind of more to go away from that and to more challenge people's learning. So we've done this. LA program has been piloted at Vanderbilt in fall of 2019. Here, the LAs were more of kind of like breakouts in the lecture. So we would have a traditional lecture, and then about every 15 minutes or so, we would have like a clicker question or a more advanced problem solving questions. And then the students would talk to people around them. And then the LAs would kind of like lead discussions in little groups throughout the classroom. By doing that, we actually surveyed the students, compared it to a control section without LAs, and we found that the LAs definitely enhanced the student sense of belonging in the classroom. So we thought this was fantastic and wanted to continue doing this. So our plan was to then use them again in one section in fall of 2020. And before the pandemic hit, we actually had already hired 13 LAs to do this, to help lead us in our close to 200-person lecture. But when the pandemic hit, it made this environment completely online. So now we had to adapt on the fly. Well, how do we incorporate these LAs? Because we obviously wanted to do so and try to keep the more belonging environment happening. So what we did is we flipped the classroom completely. And what this means in the flipped classroom is all of the lecture content is recorded on why can I say the word video, is pre-recorded in a video, and then the students watch these videos before attending synchronous lectures where they would then have more discussion times. Well, we did then help them follow along with the lectures. We made them a worksheet that had some simple questions and then some more in-depth problem-solving questions, and the students would then turn in their worksheets ahead of time for completion. Then when we had our synchronous lectures, this is where the LAs come in. They each had their own separate Zoom call. So we had 13 LAs, which they're each separate Zoom call, and they led the discussion of the worksheet and really anything that students wanted to talk about over the entire class period. So this was a big ask for the LAs because they were going to lead maybe 2 to 3 5-minute discussions. Now they were essentially running the entire class in their small groups. However, they were not alone. We had 2 instructors in this class and 1 graduate TA, so we would pop into each of the groups periodically throughout the class. We stayed for about 10 to 15 minutes to offer additional help. And these LAs, they also receive significant training. So they take a pedagogy class over in Peabody to help teach them some talk moves and kind of teach them that they're more to help facilitate discussion, and they're not supposed to be the answer givers. They really help to bring this environment alive. And we also meet with them before each week to go over the material of the week. And this environment that we set up has been absolutely fantastic and kind of like changed everything we were expecting in there. The students seem to love it. The LAs seem to love it themselves. Our data this year has been remarkably positive, again, showing a very strong sense of belonging. And we also have some data showing that not only does the presence of LAs help, but the LAs present in these small groups environments show a more synergistic relationship, therefore indicating that we should keep this set up when we return to in-person teaching. So I'm going to pass it over to Kathy, who's going to show some of our organization on Brightspace and fill in any gaps I may have missed.
Okay, thank you. No, that was great, Thomas. I don't think I had anything major to fill in, but okay, so hopefully you can see our Brightspace page. So I started here on, well, I should say we also took the course design working group, and it was extremely helpful for learning how to, for me, move from using Brightspace as just a repository of files, which I had done for years, and reasonably effectively, I think, but into something that hopefully was much more useful for the students. So we had a navigating Brightspace page, and students could come here to do anything that they needed to do. And I'm not going to click on these because there are student names. Well, these are the learning assistants, but there are students in the class associated there. But we asked, I think maybe Thomas didn't mention this. We did ask all the students to submit at least one question to a discussion board several hours before class. And they submitted it specifically to a discussion board for their learning assistant group. And so the learning assistants had a few hours before class, and we did as well, but we couldn't look at all of them. But to look over these questions, see if there were recurrent themes, and the learning assistants would then address these questions during class. Something else Thomas didn't mention is that we did have a group me set up between the instructors, the TA, and the learning assistants. And that group me would go kind of crazy for about the half hour or so before class, as the LAs would write to us asking some of these questions that were coming up on the discussion board. We had a general discussion board set up as well based on topic that anyone could post to, and Thomas and I would respond specifically to those questions. And then, as he said, each learning assistant set up their own Zoom call. And so I think this worked really well for such a large class. Rather than using breakout rooms within the large class, each group had their own call. And that way the learning assistant could use breakout rooms within their own call. And many of them did quite effectively split students into groups of 2 to 4 within their own call. And then when we were jumping around to the different rooms, we would simply use this navigating Brightspace page, click on whatever room we were going to visit, And then when we left, we'd just come back here and go into the next one. So it actually worked, I think, very, very well. And you know, there were just links to everything that they needed on this page. We had, I think the only other thing I wanted to show you is just that then we had the course organized by different exam materials, and just to, so this would be the page for any particular day. And so within here, we had the learning goals for the students. We had the reading for them to do. We had all the videos for them to watch, including any notes or blank slides. We had the link to the worksheet and the assignment folder where they would upload the worksheet, and they got a tiny bit of credit every day for turning in the worksheet and for going to class. We reminded them to submit their question to the discussion board, and then we had a link to the Navigating Brightspace folder for their Zoom call. So we tried to put everything in here very clearly what they were supposed to do every day. So I think one thing I wanted to emphasize is that, I mean, I've taught this course for several years, and it's a lecture style course. So we've given lectures during class. You know, we started with, Thomas talked about having some clicker questions and trying to gradually increase the active learning that we do during class, but it was somewhat limited what we could do. And students had to do all the practicing outside of class or by coming to office hours. And what to me was really remarkable this last semester, that was partly having the LAs and partly the fact that we flipped the classroom, is that we were doing all that hard work of helping the students practice how to really apply their knowledge together, rather than them having to do that all separately. And Thomas mentioned this, but one of the evaluations we did was to look at our end of semester course evaluations, the ones not about the instructor per se, but about the course itself. And there were 3 questions, one about I feel comfortable asking questions in class, one about sort of I understand how what I learned applies to the rest of my life, and then the overall course evaluation were just much, much higher than we've ever seen in any other semester, despite the fact that we had this move to online. And so I think that really speaks to what Thomas said, that having this small group environment with a learning assistant was really extremely beneficial. So that's our 10 minutes. I'll stop there.
Thank you all so much. I want to invite all of you, if you can, to turn on your video and share your questions, share your observations, share your own experiences from the fall. If you would like, you can put your hand up in the chat and I will call on you, but if you'd rather, just unmute and ask or offer your observations.
May I ask a question for Kathy and Thomas? How did you choose your team? Like you mentioned, there was an application process. How, what kinds of things were you asking or looking for?
Yeah, so we had an application and we threw that out to basically people who have taken the class before. And we also did a subset where people who we thought we would do well, we would be like, hey, reach out to them like, hey, I think you would do good. I encourage you to apply for this. But in the application itself, we asked them questions like, what was the hardest class you've taken? How did you thrive in this hard class environment? And then questions like, how do you study? Do you study in groups? Do you think facilitation is a good way to study? And things like that. And one of the things we are looking forward to in the future is, one thing we noticed this fall is most of the students who applied and were accepted had me previously in lecture, but they didn't have Kathy's section previously in lecture. So it was a little bit like, oh, wow. Okay, this is how we're going to do this in the second part. But then we're excited as we, we're going to work together again in the fall, how we can actually have LAs who had it with both of us so they really know what to expect.
Yeah. And one thing that, maybe this is what Kathy is about to say, but I think that Thomas and Kathy did not look for the students with, you know, the highest average in the class, but instead we're looking for students with a range of experiences, students who really grappled with ideas and learned to adjust their way of approaching the course over time. And they wanted to get a group of students who represented the students in the class, right, in multiple ways.
Yeah, we actually got a lot of positive feedback. Cynthia came in and did a small group analysis, and many of the students mentioned how seeing someone who was similar to them and had succeeded and done well and was now a junior or senior really made them feel like they could do this even when it was hard. So I think that that's, you know, probably one of the biggest positives that we see from that. We did interview like 35 students for those 13 spots in the spring. We've decided going forward that we'll be a little bit more selective about who we interview next time, because that was a lot of interviews.
I have a question for Jess, if that's okay. Jess, you had students respond to readings on Perusall, and then you had them do other pre-class reading responses. And I'm curious, like, how did they feel about sort of that pretty intensive preparation for class?
I was just putting my Brightspace page up, and I want to say that I feel like I want to echo the Online and Course Design Institute, because that was clutch. I asked them, so I made a shorter, it's normally a 3-hour class. So I said that this is some asynchronous work, and we're going to make it a 2-hour class instead. So I was expecting some of that to do. To my surprise, they want the class to be longer now. I had students actually put that on my student evaluation this year, that they thought the class was too short. So I did not get complaints, believe it or not. So I don't know. Other people had, so a friend at another institution taught a similar course. But one of the big things was, though, that I really used the model of the Online Course Design Institute to structure my Brightspace page. So they never had to click any, like they literally just could click through like you do there. And that, just having it be really, I'll share, because I think that I did learn a lot from the Brightspace page. I just want to make sure that none of the students' names comes up, but I think it'll be fine. Oh, this is the wrong class, hold on. So I mean, you'll see, it looks, if you took the Online Course Design Institute, it looks remarkably like what it did then, because that was what, but the students really, I think they liked being able to do some of the processing ahead of time. And we just had it as a really clear structure. So here, now I can share. This is, I literally copied and made the figures exactly like what they did on the Online Course Design Institute. And they just would go through each of these things. So these were all the things they would do, like all of their assignments and everything were all in that week. And then they had, this was due Monday at midnight, and this was due Wednesday at 5. So yes, it looks exactly like the Online Course Design Institute.
Except I'm a little jealous of your icons. Your icons are really beautiful.
I got it off Pages, and I just used the icons off Pages.
Well, that's good to hear. That's something we all have to keep in mind, so students in general this year are saying that it feels like more work to them. And so I think that it's very important for us to be clear about why they're doing the work they're doing and what value it brings to them. And I suspect that the way there was really intentional linking between that pre-class work and then what they were doing in class was a big part of why it felt valuable and worthwhile to them.
Like we talked about, I have a policy, we don't do a reading unless we're going to talk about it. You don't do any writing unless I'm going to give you substantive feedback on it. So I think that also helped, that helped them feel like there's a point to me doing this extra work.
Mhm, mhm. What other questions do y'all have? Gil?
My question has always been intrigued by the idea of asking questions live. And like, so went to a bunch of workshops about clickers, but then that seemed like a lot of work in my classes that have somewhere between like 8 and 12 students to have them have clickers and whatnot. And I don't know how many times I'm going to use. I could use some feedback, but a lot of what I do also, if I plan to do things, sometimes they don't happen. So I'm wondering if people have any feedback on creating questions live. You know, like one of the vexing things that I'll ask questions and then like 2 people will respond, or then I have to force everyone to respond, and it's all kind of funny but not particularly useful in that I don't know what the responses are. So do you have any feedback? Do you usually had your questions ahead of time, or were you able to come up with questions on the spot and kind of compile the results? And what are the tips and tricks on that?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think, we had a lot of freshmen in our class, and I think for them, it's most useful that they've seen the question ahead of time, because it gives them this comfort that they've had a chance to think about it a little bit. So, and, with our learning assistant model, that also provided an automatic structure for the learning assistants to work through. But I will say that the learning assistants started saying that the students wanted more spontaneous questions too, where they now we can think through a question we haven't seen before. So, I mean, it ended up being more work for me, but I started providing the learning assistants with another 1 or 2 challenge problems for every day that they would go to if they had time. So, some of it was just kind of responding, I guess, to what the students requested.
But Kathy prepared that question ahead of time, right? The students didn't get it, but she had it prepped.
I pulled a ton of stuff from past exams. I mean, that's mostly where my questions came from.
I guess to give context, a lot of these things are just like intuition check. Like, is this something that you know intuitively and I can just move on? Or is this something that you don't know, so we need to pause and discuss? And like, I always had a hard time gauging how successful that is, because if 3 out of 12 students say, yeah, easy, no problem, and the other ones are quiet, then I kind of feel tempted to move forward, but maybe I'm leaving the others behind. On the other hand, I start explaining something that seems pretty intuitive to me, and like 4 or 5 are now rolling their eyes like, why are we doing this, right? So that's something that I would like, just that instant feedback. It's like, can we just move on? And it's just haven't found the right platform to do it, and it seems like online maybe it could be easier to integrate that.
Jess, you keep looking like you want to say something.
Well, I was trying to think of why might they not be responding, right? Like whenever I have a problem, I'm like, why did it happen? Like what's causing it? And some of it might be like, it's kind of a vulnerable thing to say, no, I actually don't understand. Like that's kind of a putting in a vulnerable position.
Right, and when Diana was giving her presentation, when there was like, I refuse, was that anonymous to you, or did they know that you were gonna know who refused, right? Because maybe that would be useful I don't care who said no, right, in a way.
Yeah, that's actually a really great. I was just thinking of something I've done sometimes in the past with like 30, 35 person classes where like I know which 3 kids are like, okay, let's get a move on. But I often don't know what is going on with the other 27, at least not early on. So sometimes I would give them like a 5-minute writing exercise at the end of class that was just like one question, you answer it, or like ask me one question about this thing we've just done, and just anonymously, right? So if I've taken attendance and they're there, then I know that they've done it. So they get, this is like one of those writerly tasks, it's in that bucket. But then that's not like in that moment, it's to set up the next class. So like in the moment, one thing that sometimes happened with my like big group, small group, big group was that I would send them off to do something and ask them to come back with a question. And then we would have the questions for the big group, and sometimes the questions were really similar and sometimes they weren't. But I have to say that did blow up one time with one group where they came back and were like, well, we don't have a question because so-and-so, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, blah. But it only happened one time. So that might work.
I was
And
wondering, oh, go ahead, Cynthia.
Go ahead, Jelaine.
Two things came to mind. I'm wondering if from your previous experience, you know, what are some of the muddiest points or misconceptions that students usually have? And so I was wondering if at some point in time you could interject and you'd say, you know, in the past, this has been really confusing for some of my students. Sometimes students get these things mixed up. And so kind of go over that. So you're kind of making yourself, or you could put yourself in the vulnerable situation to say, when I was learning this in undergrad or grad school, this was challenging for me, or I struggled with this disconnection, and so I did this. Are any of you having that thing? And then the other thing, which is related to Diana, there are things like 3-2-1 or muddiest points or exit slips that you could ask the students, where you could say, on a scale of 1 to 3, how would you rate your current level of understanding? What's one big understanding? What are you confused about today? And that could give you some anonymous using Google Forms or the discussion forums, something like that. Wasn't sure if that would be helpful to you.
Mhm. And one theme that emerged to me from listening to Jessica and Diana is both of them used images to generate student responses. So Jessica had asked students to generate images. I may be mixing this up some, but she asked students to generate images that then they could use to foster interaction in class. And Diana had a couple, you know, she had the paintings, or painting and sculpture, and then she had the graphs to respond to. And so I wonder whether I would imagine, Gil, in your classes having a graph, right, to say like which of these responses would be most reasonable for that, would be a way to sort of do a check that would, everybody can say A, B, C, or D, right? Or do a chat blast response. So.
One of the advantages of using like a Jamboard though, instead of a chat blast, is then you don't have to put your name on it, right? Like you can just put, like, I was trying to think what can do, the polling can be anonymous in a way. And this way you don't have to reveal, like, it's not my answer, right? Like that you can have a different kinds of, like, your name's not associated so publicly, which I can imagine being really hard on Zoom. Same for the polls, but if you wanted like a more like, you know, not just a simple yes, no, or multiple choice question.
And so the Jamboard everybody can see, but no one needs to identify themselves. Is that the idea?
Yeah.
Jessica, what do you want to say?
Well, if you have a small enough class, like in my visions group, we would have everybody change their name to the same thing in Zoom. And then you could do a chat blast and then it's anonymous because everybody's like the number one, or they're all some word that you come up with to change their name to. So that was really fun.
Great idea.
Top Hat also has a function where you can choose if the responses are anonymous to the students or anonymous to you. So you could set up questions ahead of time, and then it allows you to like assign each question per question. And I think the students just like have their phone out at the same time as they're in lecture. And when you assign it, it pops up on their phone asking them the question, and then they can respond. And then you can choose if they see the whole class's response or if they're just seeing their own response and you're the only one getting any responses back. And so that gives you some more options there too.
Yeah, you know, I think there's oh, no, go ahead.
No, I have a question that's perhaps not related. So go ahead if you have something about that.
Well, I was just that sometimes those Top Hat questions that are getting at something you know is a misconception, and the answers come up, and then you put the right answer, and it's maybe not the thing most students chose. There's this audible gasp that goes up in the classroom, which is kind of fun. And then they're like, "Whoa, okay, we really need to talk about that." So I think that can be really effective.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes I'm going to let Tasha talk, but sometimes when that happens, I will say, well, that's not right. So y'all go talk again and then vote again, and we'll see where we get from there. So Tasha, what do you want to?
Yeah, no, I really appreciated Diana's framing of the sort of like, I think you called it the micro lecture, and then the kind of target question in the small group. And I wondered about one thing I've kind of played around with in my synchronous sessions last term was just the timing. I'm wondering how long, I know like long lecturing we know is not pedagogically sound on Zoom. So how long is an ideal sweet spot for a mini lecture like that? And then how long did you kind of let students go off into small groups? What did you find to be the most helpful along those lines? So I guess it's both a question for Cynthia about the evidence around the lecturing and also for Diana about your experience.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I tried to keep the micro lecture like as micro as possible because, this is a 3,000 level class, and these students, I have to say that class was a gift. Like they were really strong. They weren't all my majors. There was like a real grab bag of students with different backgrounds, and they really, really worked nicely together. So, grain of salt, maybe they were just special, but I tried not to do ever more than 10 minutes, but more in the range of like 5 to 7 minutes. And often it just would start with a reminder, like, okay, this is the key thing that we were talking about, this distinction, this problem, this application, here's what we know, like what's on the table for all of us together. And then maybe like, here's, these 2 questions. With the breakout rooms, I started off keeping them short, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, because I wanted everyone to be able to share and have the conversation when we came back. That was what the group I thought would kind of get us to a really good conversation. And then I discovered that some of my very involved and wonderful graduate students were in a group together, and they solved their questions, and then they just wanted to talk about their grad school applications. And I was like, well, that's good too. Like that's, so Jessica's point about like there being space for community, I started letting them go longer, like 10 or even sometimes 15 minutes, and then coming back to the conversation. So yeah, maybe 5 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes back together to like see where we're getting.
And I don't have anything to add to that, Tasha. I will say on pre-recorded videos, people don't watch more than 6 to 8 minutes at a time, no matter how long your video is. So it's largely a waste of your time if it's much longer than that. But in terms of other data, I can't expand. I want to thank you all. I want to say I noticed 2 particular themes that I want to highlight for. So one I've already pointed out. So this notion of using images to prompt student discussion, I think is pretty powerful and applicable across different disciplines. So I think we tend to respond when we see something that is provocative or interesting. So something that we can all take away. And then the other thing that we saw with all 3 groups is all 3 Jessica, Diana, and Thomas and Kathy's courses. Is that concrete preparation that is explicitly linked to what they were doing in class was really important for them getting the most out of their class. And then, as Kathy was highlighting, that let them practice in class, that let them practice the activities that helped them do the thinking, the writing, the learning that they needed for class. So really important themes that we see across these presentations. I want to thank you so much. I want to thank the people who came in and listened. And I really want to thank our panelists. Thomas, Kathy, Jess, Diana, those were lovely. I have recorded, and so I will send a follow-up email probably tomorrow with the recording. So thank you very much, and I will see you sometime soon.
Cynthia, sorry that Jeffrey called me during that, but he clearly did not listen to my instructions about how we were exiting school today. So
worries.
Anyway.
Bye.